The night was calm. The sea stretched endlessly under the moonlight. And then, without warning, the darkness erupted. A thunderous explosion split the ocean as a Japanese transport carrying thousands of soldiers was torn in half. Men screamed, fire lit the sky, and within minutes, an entire regiment was swallowed by the waves. The killer? Not a battleship, not an airplane, but an American submarine, firing a weapon Japan never truly feared, until it was too late. The Mark 14 torpedo. This is the story of how America stunned Japan, not with massive fleets or swarms of bombers, but with silent steel hunters beneath the waves. Submarines armed with torpedoes that had once been cursed as useless, now perfected into instruments of annihilation. At Eniwetok and Tinian, over 20,000 Japanese troops would never set foot on land, their lives claimed before the battle even began. The Pacific in 1944 was not just a battlefield, it was a graveyard waiting to be filled. Japan's empire stretched wide, its soldiers stationed across distant islands. But those men depended on ships, convoys of transports and destroyers that sailed across hostile seas. And beneath those seas, American submarines lay in wait, engines silent, periscopes cutting the waves like the eyes of sharks. The weapon that made these ambushes possible was the Mark 14 torpedo. At the start of the war, sailors despised it. Torpedoes often missed, failed to explode, or detonated too soon. It seemed cursed, a weapon unworthy of the crews who risked their lives to launch it. But after months of painful trial and error, America fixed its flaws. By 1943, the Mark 14 was deadly reliable. And when unleashed in spreads of 6, 8, or 10, it was a force no ship could withstand. In the waters near Eniwetok, the Japanese learned this lesson in fire and blood. Convoys carrying thousands of troops set sail, bound for the island's defense. But the ocean was no longer theirs. The USS Trigger, USS Trout, and USS Seahorse were already prowling. They didn't attack once. They struck again and again, night after night, until transports were ablaze and the sea turned into a burning grave. And before we dive deeper into this brutal campaign, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and share it. Trust me, what comes next is even darker. Because the Japanese weren't just losing ships, they were losing the very soldiers meant to save their empire. The sinking of these troop transports was more than tactical victory. It was psychological devastation. Japanese soldiers who had survived years of battle never even reached the battlefield. Instead, they drowned in black waters, their cries lost to the night. Survivors clung to wreckage, watching their comrades vanish beneath the waves, knowing there would be no rescue. The convoy escorts tried desperately to hunt the submarines, but depth charges exploded blindly, while the steel predators slipped away into the abyss. For the Americans, each sinking was proof. The Mark 14 torpedo was no longer a failure. It was the blade that cut Japan's lifelines, one transport at a time. The sun rose over the Pacific in February 1944, casting a golden haze over the vast waters near the Marshall Islands. On the surface, it seemed serene, almost peaceful, but beneath that calm horizon, a storm of steel and fire was about to erupt. The Japanese Empire had long fortified its holdings in the Central Pacific, confident that their island bastions could repel any American advance. Yet what they did not expect was the silent hunter lurking in the depths, the U.S. submarine force, armed with the controversial yet devastating Mark 14 torpedo. By this stage of the war, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz had set his sights on Eniwetok Atoll, a key stepping stone toward the Marianas. The atoll, ringed with coral reefs and dense fortifications, was defended by nearly 5,000 Japanese troops under the command of General Yoshimi Nishida. Nearby Tinian Island, part of the Marianas chain, boasted an even larger garrison of 15,000 soldiers. Together, these islands represented the shield of Japan's Pacific defense perimeter. But before the Marines and Army divisions could storm the beaches, the U.S. submarine fleet was ordered to cut off the lifelines that sustained those garrisons. The sea would become their graveyard, and the weapon of choice was the Mark 14. One patrol stands out, a mission led by Commander Frederick B. Warder aboard the USS Seawolf. His log records the moment they sighted a heavily escorted Japanese convoy bound for Eniwetok. The convoy carried thousands of reinforcements, tanks, and artillery pieces desperately needed to strengthen the atoll's defenses. Warder watched through the periscope, his voice calm but laced with steel. Range 2,000 yards. Targets bearing northwest. We will fire a full spread. The torpedo room below came alive with the clanking of metal and the tense whispers of sailors. Seaman Johnson and Murphy double-checked the gyro settings, sweat dripping despite the cool air. Warder gave the order. The hiss of compressed air echoed as 3 Mark 14s shot from their tubes, leaving streams of bubbles as they hurtled toward the convoy. Minutes stretched like hours. Then, an eruption. A Japanese transport shuddered violently, flames bursting from its midsection. Sailors on the Seawolf erupted in muffled cheers, quickly silenced as depth charges began to roll from the enemy destroyer's stern. The Japanese escort commander, Captain Hiroshi Iwasaki, barked orders aboard the destroyer Yukikase. Turn hard to port. Drop charges at 150 meters. Explosions thundered through the sea, shaking the submarine's hull and tossing men against bulkheads. Warder gritted his teeth, whispering, "Hold her steady. She'll ride it out." When the barrage subsided, Seawolf surfaced hours later under cover of night. In her wake, 2 Japanese transports smoldered, their wreckage slowly sinking into the Pacific. Hundreds of soldiers who had been bound for Eniwetok never made it ashore. This was only one encounter, but multiplied across dozens of submarines, the effect was catastrophic. The Japanese Navy began to lose ships at a rate they could not sustain. Between January and March 1944, U.S. subs sank nearly 30 vessels bound for Eniwetok and Tinian, troopships, supply freighters, and oil tankers. On Eniwetok itself, Japanese defenders soon realized their predicament. Sergeant Kenji Morita later recalled in his diary, "Recovered after the battle. We wait for reinforcements that never come. We hear rumors of submarines sinking our transports. Hunger grows, and the men whisper of death approaching from the sea." The U.S. Navy, aware of Japanese shortages, intensified its pressure. Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet launched bombardments, while the submarines prowled relentlessly. Every convoy that attempted to slip through the blockade was stalked. The Mark 14 torpedo, once criticized for its early malfunctions, was now devastatingly reliable after modifications. At Tinian, the story was no different. Japanese Colonel Kaiichiko Ogata, responsible for organizing defenses, received fewer supplies with each passing week. American submarines cut his lifelines, ensuring that when U.S. Marines eventually stormed the beaches, his men would face them with dwindling ammunition and meager rations. One particularly dramatic episode came from the USS Tang, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane, one of the most aggressive skippers of the war. In late February 1944, O'Kane shadowed a massive Japanese convoy carrying nearly 10,000 troops bound for Tinian. The seas were rough, visibility poor, but O'Kane took the risk. He lined up his sights and unleashed a salvo of 6 torpedoes. Within minutes, chaos erupted. One transport erupted in flames, another snapped in half, spilling hundreds of soldiers into the churning sea. Survivors clung desperately to floating wreckage, their cries swallowed by the roar of explosions. Japanese destroyers scrambled to respond, but O'Kane coolly maneuvered Tang into deeper waters, evading the counterattack. Later, when O'Kane surfaced, he noted grimly in his report, "Enemy troop strength to Tinian reduced by thousands. Convoy destroyed. Survivors scattered." His words, clinical and detached, belied the enormity of what had occurred. An entire wave of reinforcements annihilated beneath the waves. The Japanese High Command, furious and desperate, accused their escorts of incompetence. Yet the truth was far more devastating. American submarines had achieved dominance of the Pacific shipping lanes. No matter how heavily guarded, no convoy was safe. Onshore, the results were immediate. At Eniwetok, American Marines stormed the beaches on February 17, 1944. Though they faced fierce resistance, many defenders were already weakened by lack of supplies. The battle, while bloody, ended in a decisive U.S. victory. Out of nearly 5,000 Japanese defenders, only 50 survived. At Tinian, the stage was being set for a larger assault. The submarine campaign had already doomed much of its garrison. By the time the island fell months later, The Japanese could only fight desperately with what little they had left. The Mark 14 torpedo, once derided as a flawed weapon, had become the unseen force that reshaped the Pacific. Its silent strikes at sea determined the fate of battles long before soldiers clashed on the beaches. And in these waters, tens of thousands of Japanese troops met their end without ever firing a shot. The Pacific, vast and merciless, had become their grave. The night before the invasion of Eniwetok, February 16, 1944, the Pacific air was thick with tension. Offshore, the American fleet loomed like a city of steel and firepower. Battleships Idaho, Pennsylvania, and Tennessee sat poised to unleash their guns, while carriers launched wave after wave of reconnaissance aircraft. On the horizon, flashes of bombardment lit up the darkness as destroyers rained shells on Japanese positions. The sea, calm under the moonlight, concealed the fate of thousands who would soon meet in blood and chaos. In the Japanese command bunker on Eniwetok, Colonel Yoshimi Nishida studied his dwindling maps by lantern light. His officers, haggard and tense, waited for orders. Reinforcements had been promised, but word had arrived days earlier of entire convoys being swallowed by American submarines. Nishida's voice was steady, though his heart was heavy. "Men, we hold Eniwetok for the Emperor. We cannot expect rescue. We fight with what we have. Remember, death is lighter than a feather, but duty is heavier than a mountain." His soldiers nodded in grim silence. They were cut off, but they would fight. At dawn, February 17th, American landing craft began to form up in the surf. The sky thundered as naval guns opened fire. Shells screamed overhead, erupting in geysers of sand and flame across the atoll. Entire coconut groves were shredded, bunkers collapsed, and Japanese positions disappeared under clouds of smoke. Yet, in their tunnels and pillboxes, the defenders waited, determined to bleed the invaders. Aboard one of the Higgins boats, Marine Sergeant Thomas Red Mallory gripped his M1 Garand, knuckles white. The spray of seawater soaked his uniform as the coxswain shouted above the roar, 30 seconds. Mallory turned to the young private beside him, barely 19, his eyes wide with fear. "Kid," Mallory muttered, "keep your head low, and for God's sake, keep moving. Don't stop for anything." The boat slammed against the reef. The ramp clattered down. The men surged forward into waist-deep water under the howl of machine gun fire. From hidden bunkers, Japanese Nambu machine guns opened up, stitching the water with deadly spray. Marines fell into the surf, staining the waves red. Yet the assault pressed on. Mortar shells burst among the landing craft, tossing men and debris into the air. Behind them, Shermans mounted with waiting gear lumbered ashore, their 75mm guns blasting bunkers one by one. One Marine flamethrower team, led by Corporal James "Jimmy" Harper, crawled toward a reinforced pillbox that had pinned down his platoon. Bullets cracked overhead as he motioned his assistant forward. Harper rose to his knees, unleashed a jet of fire, and the bunker erupted in screams and smoke. His comrades surged past, shouting, "Move, move, move." Each yard gained was paid in blood. The battle for Eniwetok lasted 3 days. Marines of the 22nd Regiment clawed their way across beaches and jungle thickets, rooting out defenders who fought to the death. Snipers perched in palm trees, firing until tanks leveled them. Japanese soldiers charged in desperate banzai attacks, their cries echoing in the chaos. They hurled grenades, clutched bayonets, and fought hand-to-hand until cut down. By the end, only a handful remained alive. Sergeant Mallory, exhausted and caked in sand, sat against the wreckage of a bunker on the evening of the 19th. Smoke still curled from the battlefield. He looked at the bodies of Japanese soldiers who had refused surrender. "They fought like demons," he muttered quietly, almost in respect. The cost had been high, but the atoll was in American hands. Out of nearly 5,000 defenders, fewer than 50 had survived. But while Eniwetok fell, the greater test awaited at Tinian. Tinian, the largest of the Mariana Islands, was defended by nearly 15,000 Japanese troops under Colonel Kaichika Ogata. Unlike Eniwetok, Tinian was heavily fortified, with interlocking fields of fire, caves, and trenches. Yet the Japanese garrison faced a crippling problem. The submarine blockade had strangled their supplies. Ammunition was scarce. Rations were cut. Still, the defenders prepared to resist with ferocity. In June 1944, the U.S. Navy unleashed one of the most devastating bombardments of the Pacific campaign. Battleships and cruisers fired nonstop for days, reducing much of Tinian's surface to rubble. Yet underground tunnels sheltered Japanese troops, who waited for the Americans to come closer. On July 24th, the assault began. Unlike the obvious beaches the Japanese had fortified, U.S. commanders chose to land on the narrow white beaches on Tinian's northwest coast, a daring gamble. In the early hours, Marines stormed ashore in a surprise landing. The Japanese, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. Private First Class Daniel Ortiz, clutching his Thompson submachine gun, leapt from his landing craft into knee-deep surf. Bullets hissed past, but the Marines pushed forward, using flamethrowers and grenades to clear trenches. Ortiz remembered the moment vividly in his journal. The sand shook beneath us from the shelling. The air was thick with smoke and screams. You couldn't think, only move. If you stopped, you died. On the Japanese side, Colonel Ogata issued his fateful order. Every man is a fortress. We fight until our last breath. The Americans will not take Tinian easily. His troops obeyed with fanatical resolve. Night after night, they launched suicidal banzai charges, their cries tearing through the darkness. Marines, weary and bloodied, stood their ground with machine guns and mortars, mowing down waves of attackers. The fields were littered with bodies by dawn. The fighting on Tinian was brutal and intimate. Caves had to be cleared one by one. Marines hurled satchel charges into tunnels, the concussions collapsing entire chambers. In one sector, Japanese defenders disguised themselves as civilians, ambushing Marines at close range before being cut down. It was war stripped to its rawest, most savage form. Yet despite their courage, the Japanese were fighting a doomed battle. Cut off by American submarines, starved of supplies, and battered by naval firepower, their resistance began to crumble. By early August, organized defense collapsed. Marines swept through the island, silencing the last holdouts. The capture of Tinian was decisive. Not only had the U.S. eliminated 15,000 defenders, but the island itself became the launching ground for something even more devastating. The runway base for B-29 bombers, including the Enola Gay, which would later deliver the atomic bomb to Hiroshima. For the Japanese, the loss of Eniwetok and Tinian was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological blow. Their navy had been humiliated at sea, their soldiers abandoned to die on isolated islands, their empire shrinking with every passing month. Officers whispered bitterly about the submarines that had gutted their supply lines, and the Mark 14 torpedo that had destroyed entire convoys. The Pacific had become a graveyard not just for ships, but for the very dream of Japanese dominance. And the Americans, step by bloody step, were closing in on Japan itself. The battle for Tinian was over by August 1st, 1944, but the echoes of gunfire and the acrid scent of smoke lingered in the humid air long after the last Japanese stronghold was silenced. Marines trudged across the scarred landscape, weary yet triumphant, their boots crunching over shattered coral, twisted metal, and the bodies of men who had chosen death over surrender. For the Americans, Tinian was more than just another island wrested from Japanese control. It was the crown jewel of the Marianas, a prize that would alter the course of the Pacific War forever. In the shattered command post where Colonel Kaiichiro Ogata had made his final stand, American soldiers found his body among the ruins. He had died with his sword in hand, refusing to be taken alive. On the walls, hastily scribbled Japanese characters told the story of his resolve. To die for the emperor is to live forever. The words, stark and defiant, embodied the spirit of the defenders. Yet outside, it was clear their sacrifice had been in vain. The statistics spoke of annihilation. Out of nearly 15,000 Japanese defenders, fewer than 300 were taken prisoner. The rest were killed in battle, by artillery, gunfire, flamethrowers, grenades, or their own hand in ritual suicide. In contrast, American losses were tragic but comparatively small, just over 300 dead and around 1,500 wounded. The disparity shocked observers. The Japanese had fought with desperate courage, but they had been ground down by overwhelming firepower, superior planning, and the inexorable chokehold of American submarines cutting their lifelines. On the ground, Marines pieced together the scale of the submarine blockade's impact. They found warehouses filled with spoiled rice, crates of unused rifles, and bunkers where soldiers had clutched rusting bayonets for lack of ammunition. Prisoners admitted they had been reduced to half rations for weeks before the invasion, subsisting on rice mixed with weeds and scraps of fish. One captured lieutenant confessed bitterly, "We were not beaten on Tinian. We were starved and left to die by the sea." American submarines had been merciless. The Mark 14 torpedo, once plagued by failures, was now perfected, and it was destroying the Japanese Navy from beneath the waves. Convoys meant to reinforce Tinian never arrived, their transports resting on the ocean floor. Names of lost ships like the Ikoku Maru, Kashiai, and Yasukuni Maru whispered through Japanese ranks like curses. Survivors told stories of burning oil slicks, men clinging to debris, and sharks circling the wreckage. For the soldiers stranded on the islands, the ocean itself had become their executioner. While Marines secured the island, engineers and Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions, moved in with astonishing speed. Within days, bulldozers roared across Tinian, flattening fields and cutting runways into the coral. The Japanese had built airstrips before the battle, but the Americans expanded them into something far greater. Massive airbases capable of launching B-29 superfortresses across the Pacific. By late 1944, these runways were alive with activity. Sleek silver bombers lined the airfields, their engines thundering as they prepared for long missions deep into Japanese territory. From Tinian, the U.S. could strike Tokyo itself. For the first time, Japan's home islands lay within reach of American air power. The psychological effect was devastating. Soldiers who had fought to defend the island died, knowing their homeland would now face the same kind of bombardment that had rained down on German cities in Europe. Among the Marines, the victory at Tinian carried a strange mix of pride and unease. Sergeant Thomas Red Mallory, who had fought at both Eniwetok and Tinian, wrote in a letter home, "We've taken another island, but God, the price these Japs are willing to pay. It makes you wonder if this war will ever end. How do you break a people who would rather die than live?" His words echoed the growing realization among American troops. Every island captured brought them closer to Japan, but every battle grew bloodier, more desperate. Civilians on Tinian, mostly Chamorros who had lived under Japanese rule, emerged from hiding after the battle. Many were emaciated, having endured years of forced labor and shortages. For them, the sight of American soldiers was both terrifying and liberating. One elderly villager reportedly told a Marine interpreter, "The Japanese said you were monsters, but you bring food. You bring medicine. Maybe you are not monsters after all." Like the German prisoners who had once been astonished by Coca-Cola and ice cream, the people of Tinian were discovering the vast contrast between Japanese propaganda and American reality. Meanwhile, on the Japanese side, the fall of Tinian was seen as catastrophic. Admiral Somu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, admitted grimly, "The loss of the Marianas is the loss of the war." He knew that from Tinian, Saipan, and Guam, the Americans would unleash strategic bombing on Japan's cities, industries, and morale. In Tokyo, despair spread quietly among the military high command. Officers still spoke of sacrifice and honor, but the truth was clear. The tide of war had turned irrevocably. The weapons of the battle told their own story. American Shermans with flamethrowers had reduced bunkers to charred ruins. Bazookas blasted apart caves where Japanese soldiers had fought to the last man. Grenades rolled into tunnels left only silence in their wake. The Marines, armed with M1 Garens and bars, had swept across fields where Japanese defenders clutched Arisaka rifles with dwindling ammunition. On the beaches, landing craft lay wrecked, reminders of the ferocity of the first hours. And scattered among the ruins were broken Japanese swords, symbols of a warrior code that could not withstand the grinding machine of modern war. By August 2nd, the Stars and Stripes flew over Tinian. Bugles sounded. Marines stood at attention. The island, once thought impregnable, was firmly in American hands. But in the hushed conversations of the officers' tents, another thought emerged. What would come next? They knew the runways on Tinian would be used not just for conventional bombing, but for something far more devastating, something whispered only in code and rumor. The Pacific was closing in on Japan, one island at a time. And with each victory, the Americans grew stronger, more confident, more determined. For the Japanese, the defeat at Tinian was not just a loss of territory. It was the beginning of an end they could no longer avoid. The ghosts of Eniwetok and Tinian lingered in the minds of all who fought there. For the Americans, they were steps toward final victory. For the Japanese, they were tombstones in a vast watery graveyard. And for history, they marked the moment when the balance of power in the Pacific shifted irreversibly, carried on the wings of submarines, torpedoes, and bombers rising from coral runways. The smoke of battle had drifted away from Tinian, but its consequences reached far beyond the coral reefs and broken bunkers of the island. What unfolded in the weeks that followed was not only a strategic victory, but a profound psychological shift that reverberated through the Pacific. The Japanese Empire, once seen as unstoppable in its early conquests, was now bleeding from wounds it could no longer heal. In Tokyo, the news of Tinian's fall spread like wildfire through military and civilian circles alike. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's resignation after the fall of Saipan had already shaken confidence, but now the reality was undeniable. The Americans were no longer just clawing at the outer edges of Japan's empire. They had taken its beating heart in the Marianas. From these islands, the skies above Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka would soon be darkened by the wings of the B-29 superfortress. For the Japanese Navy, the situation was even worse. Their once proud fleet, which had terrified the Pacific in 1941 and 1942, was now crippled. Submarines stalked the shipping lanes, tearing apart transports with Mark 14 torpedoes that now functioned with deadly precision. Between January and August 1944, over 500 Japanese merchant ships were sunk. Every month, more oil tankers, troop transports, and cargo ships slipped beneath the waves. Japan's lifeblood, its fuel, its food, its reinforcements, was bleeding out into the Pacific. The sinking of troop transports bound for Tinian had been catastrophic. Survivors who washed ashore brought tales of horror. Men leaping from burning decks, explosions splitting ships in two, sharks circling helpless soldiers. One private from the 50th Division, rescued after clinging to driftwood for days, whispered to his commander, "We never saw the enemy. Only fire. Only the sea." His words summed up the new terror. The enemy was no longer visible. The Americans struck from the depths, unseen, unstoppable. For American submarine crews, the victory was not without risk. Men aboard the USS Trigger, USS Trout, and others often described the deafening roar of depth charges as Japanese destroyers desperately tried to exact revenge. The whole boat shook like a tin can, one sailor recalled. Plaster rained from the ceiling, lights flickered, and we could taste the air growing thin. But then silence. The destroyers moved on, and we slipped away. It was a game of death beneath the sea, where a single mistake meant a steel coffin for dozens of men. Back on Tinian, the Americans wasted no time. Seabees and Army engineers transformed the island into one of the largest airbases in the world. The new runways, long, wide, and reinforced, became home to more than 500 B-29 bombers. Every day, the skies roared with the sound of engines as the massive aircraft lifted off, their bellies packed with bombs. Soon, entire Japanese cities would feel the devastation that had begun at sea. For the Japanese soldiers who had fought at Tinian, the psychological blow was devastating. Survivors wrote in diaries, later discovered after the war, that they had been abandoned. One officer's words were scrawled in fading ink. "We waited for reinforcements. None came. The sea betrayed us. Our ships were gone, our supplies burned. We fought with honor, but we were already dead before the Americans landed." On the American home front, the news of Tinian's capture was celebrated with cautious pride. Families who had lost loved ones at Tarawa or Saipan hoped the momentum meant the war was drawing closer to its end. Newspapers printed triumphant headlines. "Tinian captured. U.S. now in range of Tokyo." Yet buried beneath the celebration was an unspoken dread. Everyone knew the battles ahead would only grow more brutal. Inside the halls of American military planning, Tinian was more than a stepping stone. It was the launching pad for the final phase of the Pacific War. From its runways, the B-29s would bomb Japan relentlessly, softening it for invasion. But in hushed conversations among generals, another plan was whispered, one that would turn Tinian from a battlefield into a place forever etched in history. That secret would not be revealed until 1945. For the Japanese people, the blockade imposed by American submarines and the fall of the Marianas began to take a devastating toll. Rice rations shrank, fuel disappeared, factories stalled, and cities grew darker at night. The once proud nation, promised victory by its leaders, now faced the slow tightening of a noose. The war they had been told was glorious was becoming a war of starvation. And yet, despite everything, Japanese propaganda refused to admit defeat. Radio Tokyo blared with defiant words. The Americans may have taken Tinian, but they cannot take the spirit of Japan. Every man, woman, and child will rise against them. The broadcasts, filled with fury, rang hollow compared to the whispers of hunger in the streets and the telegrams of dead sons arriving at homes across the empire. On the front lines, American Marines looked back at Tinian not only as a victory, but as a warning. They had seen the fanaticism of their enemy firsthand. Soldiers leapt from cliffs rather than surrender. Civilians, terrified by years of lies, threw themselves into the sea with their children. It was a glimpse of what awaited them on islands still to come, places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. As one Marine captain remarked grimly, "If they fight like this for every island, the road to Japan will be paved in blood." But the tide of war was irreversible. The silent hunters of the deep, the submarines and their torpedoes, ensured that Japan could no longer reinforce or resupply its garrisons. Every new battle would find Japanese troops weaker, hungrier, and more isolated. Eniwetok and Tinian were not just victories of strategy. They were victories of attrition, proof that America's industrial might and technological innovation could strangle an empire thousands of miles from its shores. By the end of 1944, Japan's navy was a shadow of its former self. Its merchant fleet was shattered, its soldiers scattered across islands where death waited in every wave. The war that had begun with the thunder of bombs at Pearl Harbor was now grinding toward its inevitable conclusion. But the story of Tinian was far from over. For in the heart of that island, on those massive runways carved into coral, a new chapter of warfare was about to be written. A chapter that would bring fire to the skies of Japan and death on a scale the world had never before witnessed. The fall of Tinian was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something far larger, something that would forever change the course of history. From the beaches littered with wreckage and the bunkers blasted into silence, the island was reborn into a machine of war unlike anything the world had ever seen. The engineers, the Seabees, and the soldiers who stayed behind worked tirelessly, carving vast runways into the coral earth. Within months, the island that had once bristled with Japanese defenses became the greatest airbase on Earth. From these runways, the United States Army Air Forces unleashed the might of the B-29 superfortress. Day after day, the skies thundered as hundreds of bombers lifted off, their massive wings shimmering in the tropical heat. They carried with them a deadly cargo, tons of incendiaries, explosives, and later, something far more powerful. The Japanese home islands, once believed to be safe behind the shield of the Pacific, now found themselves under relentless assault. Night after night, the B-29s roared across the sky. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, cities that had stood for centuries, were reduced to burning rubble. Entire neighborhoods were consumed by firestorms so intense that survivors described the wind itself catching fire. Civilians huddled in shelters as the ground shook, as if the very earth were crying out in pain. For the Japanese people, the sound of distant engines became the sound of fear itself. Tinian had become the dagger pointed directly at the heart of Japan. Yet, even as the firebombings raged, a darker plan was being prepared in silence. Deep within guarded facilities back in the United States, scientists worked on a weapon unlike any in history, the atomic bomb. And when it was ready, Tinian would serve as the stage from which this terrible drama would unfold. In August 1945, 2 aircraft left Tinian, carrying with them weapons of unimaginable power. The Enola Gay carried Little Boy, destined for Hiroshima. The Boxcar carried Fat Man, bound for Nagasaki. The crews took off from those very runways that had once echoed with the boots of Japanese defenders, and hours later, the world was changed forever. Cities vanished in blinding flashes. Tens of thousands perished instantly. Many more would suffer in the days, months, and years that followed. Humanity had entered the atomic age, and it had begun on Tinian. For the Japanese high command, the shock was absolute. The empire had already been bleeding, its navy shattered, its skies dominated, its people starving. But the atomic bombings delivered a final, crushing blow. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito spoke to his people in a radio broadcast, urging them to endure the unendurable. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. For American servicemen who had fought at Tinian, the news was met with a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. They had lived through fire and death, through nights of terror beneath shellfire and days of exhaustion under the sun. They had watched friends fall beside them, seen civilians die in despair, and felt the weight of history pressing on their shoulders. Now, the end had come, but it carried with it a haunting silence. Victory was theirs, but at a cost measured in lives, in memories, in scars that would never fade. For the Japanese who had once lived on Tinian, or who had fought there, the war's end brought only devastation. Their homeland lay in ruins, their families scattered, their dreams shattered. Soldiers who had once believed in the divine destiny of Japan now walked as prisoners, haunted by the futility of their struggle. For them, the island of Tinian would forever be remembered as a graveyard, a place where courage met tragedy, and where hope was swallowed by fire. The legacy of Tinian, and of the battles that surrounded it, is profound. It was a turning point in the Pacific War, the moment when the tide could no longer be denied. It showed the brutal efficiency of submarine warfare, the devastating power of air supremacy, and the terrible consequences of total war. But above all, it served as the launchpad for the weapon that ended the conflict and ushered in a new age of fear, of deterrence, of uneasy peace under the shadow of nuclear fire. Today, if you walk along the runways of Tinian, the echoes of history still linger. The cracked concrete bears silent witness to the thunder of bombers, the cries of men, the roar of engines. The beaches still whisper of the desperate battle, where Marines fought inch by inch, and Japanese defenders chose death over surrender. It is a place frozen in time, a reminder of both human ingenuity and human destruction. The story of Tinian is not just the story of a single island. It is the story of a world at war, of nations clashing in a struggle for survival, of technology advancing faster than humanity could control, and of the heavy price paid by soldiers and civilians alike. It is a story that reminds us of the cost of war and of the fragile line between victory and annihilation. And so, the saga of Tinian comes to its close, not as a mere battle on a map, but as a turning point in human history. What began as a bloody clash of soldiers on coral sands ended with the dawn of the atomic age. From the silence of submarines that stalked the seas, to the thunder of bombers rising into the sky, to the blinding flash that ended a war, Tinian was at the center of it all. It stands as a reminder that wars are not won by battles alone, but by the choices of nations, the resilience of soldiers, and the sacrifices of countless lives. The ghosts of Tinian, American, Japanese, and civilian alike, still whisper their stories across its fields and runways. They remind us that history is not only written in victory, but in tragedy, in memory, and in the hope that such destruction may never come again. This was the island where the Pacific War turned its final corner. This was the place where history bent toward its most devastating chapter. This was Tinian, the battlefield that became the birthplace of the end.